Arkansas Psychological Association partnered with the Association of State Provincial Psychology Boards continuing education event on psychology and jurisdictional compact, which will be further known as PsyPACT. I am Camera Elizabeth Mays, president of ARPA, whose primary purpose is to advance psychology as a science, profession, and a means of promoting human welfare in a challenging and changing world. 2020 has been unprecedented, specifically in respect to COVID-19, that is deaths, social distancing, seclusion, cancellation of sports and social gatherings, etc. Additionally, the amplification and magnification of systemic injustice has forced corporate America and the world to acknowledge what oppressed people have always known and experienced. The aftermath is still evolving. Because people are suffering emotionally, telemedicine options for accessing mental health is paramount. Today, Dr. Alex Sigel will present on PsyPACT, an interstate compact that will facilitate telehealth and temporary in-person, face-to-face practice of psychology across jurisdictional boundaries. Thank you to the Government Relations Committee of ARPA, led by Drs. Tisha Dean and Glenn White, for their important legislation and advocacy work. And thank you to Kyla Holmes, Professional Development Committee Chair, for this event as well. Now for some housekeeping notes. For the webinar, please be sure your audio and video are muted. If you do have questions, type any questions you have into the chat, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. There also will be a 5-minute break approximately at 1 p.m. You will get information near the end of today's event on how to get the continuing education credit, which is obtained after you complete an evaluation. And finally, the video and slides will be made available after the event. Thank you, and Glenn White will proceed.
Okay, thank you, Cammie. Yeah, I'm Glenn White. I'm a member of the Government Relations Committee. I've been active for the last few years on legislative matters, and I've been active with ARPA basically since I've been in Arkansas. I came here in 1984. So I've been around a while, and this particular thing we're doing here with Dr. Sigel is going to be really important, and it's very timely, as Cammie pointed out. We've got all the pressure. Basically, telehealth and telepsychology was already expanding. There was more pressure to utilize this medium. And then the pandemic hit, and as most of you know, that is a major way we're providing services now. Now, there was already a trend around the country to expand and give regulatory laws some teeth around telehealth kinds of services. And it's really picked up speed. There are already proposals I think Alex is going to talk about shortly. Nationally, there's been talk about in Arkansas passing some laws. So all of this push means there are people outside our profession who may not appreciate our situation. So one of the things that I think some of us are thinking is that PsyPACT, originating as it has under psychology profession, would be a good way to get something regulatory in place in the law rather than take a chance on what winds up getting out there anyway. Alex, about 2 years ago, I think it was, presented to Arkansas Psych Association leadership on this very topic. And at the time, we were thinking about looking into joining the compact, but it turned out to be too late for one of the deadlines to be introduced in the legislative session. So the next opportunity for legislation is in the 2021 session, which starts at the beginning of 2021 in January. So ARPA decided we need to really consider what we're going to do about PsyPACT at this point and make some decision. And the vote by the board then a couple of months ago is to proceed with the preparations for this. In order to get things kind of together in our psychology community in Arkansas informed about this, we spoke with the Arkansas Psychology Board about what we were talking about doing. And just so you'll know, they take no position one way or another on this and that's just kind of what they have to do in their position. We also did a survey of ARPA members at the time, giving some information and asking people's opinions about joining the PsyPACT Compact. And at that time, 70% favored joining it. We also then, subsequent to that, sent out some information and resources that most of you may recall. We sent that through the ARPA listserv, but we also sent something to all the licensed psychologists in Arkansas, whether they were members of ARPA or not. We included things about the pros and cons, because there are some people who are uncomfortable at this point with joining the compact. So we tried to provide a transparency in terms of information on both sides and plenty of resources to explore, and asking for more feedback. So today, Dr. Sigel is going to give us a lot of key information, and this will allow, if any of you have final questions or feedback, this will be your opportunity to do that. And then if ARPA continues to pursue the compact, then be aware this means we're going to need some help from people in the psychology community. We'll first have to find a legislator to sponsor the bill, and then we're also going to need some help advocating for it. And that means talking to legislators, sending them letters, emails, calls. In other words, we need volunteers, and you'll hear from Dr. Dean about that later. So that's kind of the background. So let's go ahead and give Alex his chance. He's from ASPPB. And now we'll ask you this, just as Cami said, remember, please everybody keep yourself on mute, audio and video, certainly no screen sharing. And then as you have questions, put those in chat. Just go to your chat screen and type in your question, hit return. And then at some point by the end of the presentation, then Kyla will be handling the questioning there. That's about it. Remember, we'll have a brief break of about 5 minutes at 1 o'clock, and we'll go from there. So I will now attempt to share my screen and turn things over to Dr. Sigel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I remember quite well, 2 years or so, I was in Little Rock, and after the presentation, they asked where I wanted to go to lunch. And I said, well, I love Gus's chicken, and you have one, and we don't have one up in the Philadelphia area where I live. So I'm somewhat, after this presentation, waiting for you to send me Gus's chicken overnight so I can eat it tomorrow morning. But seriously, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about telehealth and telepsychology. What I thought I'd do in the first part of the session before the break is kind of talk a little bit about what telepsych is, go through the APA guidelines as well as the ASPPB standards, and then kind of focus on how life was pre-COVID, how it is now, and how it might be post-COVID in terms of providing psychological electronic telepsych services to patients. I use the term telepsych because that's in psychology, we kind of use that. Since the pandemic, everyone now uses a bigger term of telehealth, but we've kind of narrowed that to telepsych, and it's interchangeable, really. So if you give me the next slide, please. I am one of the, this is my title. I work with ASPPB. I'm the Director of Professional Affairs. Prior to that, I was the board chair of psychology in Pennsylvania and served on the licensing board here for about 13 years. As you can see, I have no conflicts. I was one of the initial drafters of PsyPACT and have talked about PsyPACT since 2000. And we started talking about telepsych in 2008, and the compact was started in about 2014, and have been introducing it to different states and psychological organizations since that time. I don't work for the commission, and there's a difference between ASPPB and the commission, which I'll talk about in the second half, because the commission is a quasi governmental entity that really has nothing to do with ASPPB. Next slide, please. So here are the objectives. We're going to talk a little bit about the legal and ethical issues about providing interjurisdictional practice pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. We're going to talk somewhat about governor's orders and what that means and what that has allowed psychologists and other healthcare providers to provide interjurisdictional practice based on those orders. We're going to talk about what PsyPACT is and what it'll allow for psychologists to do, and then kind of tell you how organized psychology looks at it. We're pretty much been endorsed by every major psychological association on a national level. Next slide, please. So ASPPB, for those of you that don't know, we are a member association. We have 65 member jurisdictions, the 50 states in the United States, and now the 5 territories, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, Guam, and the Commonwealth of North Marianas Islands. They recently joined us. And so we assist the licensing board, and also the 10 provinces and territories in Canada. So we assist the licensing boards in the United States and the licensing colleges in Canada to help them with their obligation to regulate the practice of psychology in their jurisdiction. We try to get states to play nicely together in the sandbox so that it will help with mobility and portability issues. For those of you at one point or the other to get licensed, you took the EPPP. We're the organization that has developed that exam and still provides, still organizes that exam and has an exam committee to kind of continue that operation. The other thing that I want to highlight here is a credentials bank that I would highly recommend to all of you, and particularly those of you that supervise folks or may be involved in academic involvements where you have supervisees under you, to get this information to them. The Credentials Bank is a way that you can go to our website, it's free, and start banking your credentials. So as you go through the licensure process, you're going to have to demonstrate to the licensing board or college that you have the requisite education, training, and experience. As you go through that process, you can bank that information. That will be primary source verified, so that 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road, if you need to apply or want to apply to a different state for licensure, that information will be there, and you can then apply. And for folks like me who are older and we didn't have a credentials bank, if I wanted to apply to another jurisdiction now for full licensure, that jurisdiction would require me to have a contemporaneous letter from my postdoc supervisor and from my internship site saying I completed that. My postdoc supervisor is dead and the internship site has that no longer exists. So even though I'm licensed and even though I'm known in a lot of different jurisdictions, rightfully or wrongfully, or I couldn't get licensed in any other state because I could not demonstrate that I did a postdoc, even though I'm licensed in Pennsylvania and I had to do a postdoc to get licensed, but the new jurisdiction would require a contemporaneous letter saying that I did a postdoc 25 years ago. So the Credentials Bank resolves that issue. And so once it's in the bank and once it's primary source verified, all our member jurisdictions will accept that to do that. The other thing that I'll talk a little bit about, and then the other things we'll get to as we go through, is the PLUS application. This is kind of like a universal college application. There's 17 or 18 jurisdictions that use the PLUS application. So you can use one application to apply to 17 or 18 jurisdictions, as opposed to using the application for a specific state to apply for licensure. A lot of the early careers and students like this because they see this as value added and given their ability to apply to several different states depending on where they may land a job or so forth. It just kind of facilitates that process. Next slide, please. So what is telepsych? Is it new? When we started this back in 2008, we were thinking, oh my God, we're going to have to develop a whole new language. We're going to have to come up with a whole new ethics code. We're going to have to figure out how this is different than face-to-face. And as we kind of went through the process, and as the joint task force in 2011 started, that's kind of how we started. But as we began to realize that telepsych is really not that different than face-to-face in a brick and mortar office, there are some nuances and there are some differences, but it's a different modality to provide treatment as opposed to a whole new area of psychology. And so we don't really need a separate ethics code. However, there are some things that are more unique to telepsych than face-to-face. For example, in face-to-face, well, I'll get to that when I get to a later slide. And you need to have, do you need to have special competencies? Prior to the COVID, there were a lot of people that had no clue about how to do telepsych or use a Zoom or Doxy or some other mechanism to allow for that service. Since COVID, everyone now is an expert in how to using and providing those services around the United States and Canada. The major issue that's still an issue that PsyPACT resolves, and we'll talk about this also, is how do you deal with different laws? Let me kind of give you a little teaser here. For example, in Arkansas, you have a duty to warn law. If a patient tells you they're going to hurt someone, you have the option, I think, to call law enforcement to notify the patient and so forth. In Pennsylvania, our duty to warn says we have to warn the intended victim. We could notify the police or the law enforcement authority, but if we don't notify the intended victim, we haven't fulfilled the requirements for duty to warn. Now you get to Texas, which does not have a duty to warn. So what do you do now if you're seeing someone in Arkansas, if you're in Arkansas and you're seeing a Texas patient, and that Texas patient says to you, I'm going to kill my next door neighbor. Under Arkansas law, you have a duty to either report that to law enforcement, and it's unclear as to whether you do that Arkansas or whether you'd have to do with Texas law enforcement, or notify the intended victim. If you do that, you violated Texas law. If you don't notify the intended victim or law enforcement in Texas, as required by Arkansas law, you've just violated Arkansas law. So how do you resolve the differences to report or not report, and which law takes precedent over those situations? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So telepsych is used all over in assessment and treatment and education and clinical education. You can use it for supervision. Some jurisdictions will allow supervised experience to start off face-to-face, and as the supervisee gets more comfortable and the supervisor feels that the supervisee is able to do that, they can expand to telepsych supervision. Under COVID, a lot of states have expanded this, but prior to COVID, most jurisdictions were not that keen on providing telepsychological supervisions. But it is, in the COVID world, being more accepted. It's unclear as to what will happen after the pandemic kind of moves on. And then for public education. Next slide, please. So the advantages of telepsych, you can address specific professionals with expertise. So for example, in my home state of Pennsylvania, I live in the Philadelphia area, and probably within 2 square miles of my house and my office, which are quarter mile away from each other, there are probably about 1,000 to 1,500 licensed psychologists. So that's not an issue. But if you go in the middle part of the state, between Philadelphia and Arkansas, you may not find a psychiatrist or a child psychologist, or only have 1 or 2 psychologists in certain counties in Pennsylvania. So if you're dealing with someone that has a substance abuse issue, you may not have anyone in that area that has the expertise. Telepsych will allow for that person who may have a substance abuse issue to contact and work with someone outside of the state for services, or within the state, contact someone in the Philadelphia or Pittsburgh area to provide services in Taiwan, Pennsylvania. You're also kind of combining face-to-face and remote care. It can augment. So if you're working, I used to do a lot of work with compulsive gamblers. And so in my life on Sunday mornings at 12:30, 12:45 East Coast time, a lot of my patients were struggling because that's the time they needed to call the bookie to place the bet before the 1 o'clock NFL games. With PsyPACT, with telehealth now, I could text patients or patients could text me during that time and have a conversation or a quick text message so they wouldn't reach out to the bookie, but I could kind of augment their face-to-face therapy with kind of the text messaging to help them get over that hurdle. It also allows more frequent contacts, access to care, continuity of care. If a patient of yours goes to school in a different state, for example, unless you're licensed pre-COVID in that state, you probably could not see that person unless the state gave you permission. Under COVID, they'll allow you if there's a governor's orders, but this will allow you to continue seeing that patient who's attending a university in a different state. So it has primarily access to care and continuity of care. And it also has to do with if in more complicated cases, I got an email yesterday from someone who is in Pennsylvania. They're working with a divorced couple who's dealing with their children. Their father or the parent just got relocated because of work into Delaware. So now you have a patient in Delaware, a patient in Pennsylvania, and the kids go back and forth. Can you provide therapy to someone in Delaware and Pennsylvania from Pennsylvania? And prior to that, the answer might have been no. Under COVID, with Delaware's executive order, the answer is yes. But after the executive orders expire, it may go back to answering no. And PsyPACT kind of addresses that issue to allow this to happen. Next slide, please. We talked about that extended hour of services. Clients may feel less inhibited and more willing to disclose information. Next slide. Some disadvantages, you want to be sure that you're comfortable with providing services 3,000 miles away or 100 miles away or whatever. If you're seeing someone that's actively suicidal and has been hospitalized a half dozen times within the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not your patient and it's a new patient wanting to see you, do you really want to see someone that far away that potentially may be at risk and may need hospitalizations? Are you going to be familiar with the involuntarily hospitalization criteria in that other jurisdiction? There may be, and do you want to kind of take on that dealing with a person 3,000 miles away that's that vulnerable? There are also probably some access to diagnosis that you may not want to see patients over the course based on their pathology. Some people say that given this, you don't get all the verbal cues because all you're seeing is what the camera is seeing. I know several psychologists, Mary Alvoy for one, and Keely Holmes, who have an extensive telepsychological practice. In their offices, they have several cameras, which are relatively inexpensive, set up in the rooms so that the patient can see what's going on, and they ask or require the patient to have, in addition to their computer, another camera so that they can see the whole, more of just what the face is what's going on. Next slide. Oh, goodness. So let's talk about, here are the 8 guidelines, and we'll go and spend some time talking about this one at a time. But in 2011, the APA put together a task force with ASPPD, APA, and the Insurance Trust. And it was the first time that APA set up a task force with different psychological organizations to kind of come together. And it started in 2011. We completed the work in 2013, and the board of directors of APA, the council of representatives of APA endorsed it or passed it. ASPPB also endorsed it, as well as the trust. And for any of you that know how APA works, the fact that the task force can start and complete its work within 2 years is miraculous. Some of their task force are still going on. You don't want to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder task force because that's been going on for years, and their depression task force is continually to go on. And the reason why it took, everyone was committed for this to go fast is we knew we were behind the 8 ball in 2011, and we need to kind of get caught up to kind of figure out what was going on and help guidance to psychologists who were beginning, if they wanted to provide telepsychological services in 2011. Next slide. The Article 1 is the competency of the psychologist. And the way APA guidelines are written, they're aspirational. And so they kind of like the ceiling, and they want you to work towards achieving it. The difficulty with APA regulations is they don't say a whole lot. So for example, if you read the first sentence, psychologists who provide telepsychological services. Now let me read the next phrase and think about what this means. Strive to take reasonable steps to ensure their competence. How do you strive to take reasonable steps? Is that you go on the YouTube and see one telepsychological services? Or to the other extreme, does that mean you talk to an IT expert? And so it's unclear as to what these guidelines are. The difficulty with APA guidelines for some states, as states have codified the APA guidelines into the psychological regulations, those aspirational guidelines now become the minimum standard of care. And so you're held to this standard as opposed to aspirational under APA. So you need to kind of figure out, for example, what works for each patient. You're probably not going to want to have a texting relationship with someone who may be in a nursing home who's in their 80s or 90s because they may have arthritis and they're difficulty to text. You probably will want to include some texting if you're seeing an adolescent because they may feel more comfortable with that than video chatting. How do you handle emergency situations? We touched upon that earlier in a distant community. For example, in Pennsylvania and where I live in Philadelphia, if a patient of mine who lives in Lower Marion County where I live said called me up and said they were going to hurt themselves, I know I could call the police, and in 30 seconds, they would be there to assist that patient to get them to the hospital. If a patient of mine who lived in Philadelphia County, the city of Philadelphia, which is just 12 minutes from my office, if they called me in the middle of the night, I know I can't call the police, because if I call the police, chances are it may take, and I'm going to exaggerate, a month or two before they come up and do that, because that's really not in their purview, and they're dealing with other issues. They will do that if that falls in. But the police would not be the appropriate agency to call to help escort that patient from their house to a hospital so they wouldn't hurt themselves. So can you imagine now doing that from Philadelphia into Washington State, not knowing what's going on? And so if you're going to do that, do you have a relationship with the patient and get permission from the patient to talk to an associate of theirs or friends of theirs, so that if something like that were to happen and you couldn't access the patient, or the patient needed assistance, you could then talk to someone else who could help assist you helping that person get hospitalized so they wouldn't harm themselves. Next slide. The second thing has to do with standards of care. This is kind of like doing a risk-benefit analysis. You ensure that ethical and professional standards of care are met at the outset and during each time. So each time, for example, if you're seeing a patient and when they come into your office, it's the same person because each week they're the same person coming in. But if you're having a texting or an email relationship, as some people do, how do you know that you're in fact talking to the same or texting the same person week after week? So you need to kind of ensure that person is the same. You also need to kind of find out who's in the room with the person. For example, face-to-face, if your patient says, I want my husband to come in next week to have a session, you may have a discussion with the patient as to whether that's a good idea or whether you should refer them to family therapy or couple therapy, or see them one time. But you may not know who is off camera shot in the room of the patient. And there's a horrific story where one healthcare worker was blackmailing a patient. A psychologist was seeing a senior patient who was very pissed off at her family because they weren't visiting, they didn't call, they stopped coming by, they didn't really care about her. And she was discussing with the psychologist to disinherit them from her will. The healthcare worker, who the psychologist did not know because she was off screen, was basically telling the patient, hey, if you don't give me money, I'm going to tell your kids that you're going to disinherit them. So there are other things like that. And in terms of, you also need to know if I'm a Pennsylvania psychologist and I'm seeing someone in New Mexico, for example, I need to understand the geographical, the cultural competencies in that area. For example, in New Mexico, most New Mexicans are not from Mexico, they're from Spain. And so there's a difference in how you may need to interact with the patients. And you need to know that if you're providing services into certain states like that. Next slide. Informed consent is the most important thing here. This helps you deal with the nuances from the interaction from the patient. How the patient's going to react, how you're going to explain confidentiality and storage, how you're going to explain to which laws apply. So for example, in my hypothetical about duty to warn, if you're talking to the patient, you may put into the duty to warn standards that I'm in Arkansas, you're in Texas, Arkansas law is going to take precedence. So if you tell me you're going to harm someone else, I'm going to warn that person under Arkansas law, as I'm required to do. The patient, on the other hand, says, well, wait a minute, I don't want you to do that. I'm in Texas, that's fine. Then the psychologist in Arkansas can say in the beginning, as you're discussing informed consent, then it doesn't make sense for us to continue because of the nuances of the laws, of commodity and so forth. You need to find someone else in Texas to provide those services consistent with that, that interpretation of the law. Next thing, confidentiality of data. Who controls access to the equipment? No one needs to be an IT expert, but you should have consultation. Prior to COVID, all telepsychological services had to be HIPAA compliant. The feds have kind of relaxed that standard, and you can use telephone or voice VOP, which aren't HIPAA compliant. And so in COVID, in some states, you don't have to do that. Arkansas, which I tell people all the time, even though you may not have to use a HIPAA compliant, as I understand Arkansas law still says, even under COVID, that you must follow the APA guidelines, you must follow HIPAA. And so if someone is coming into Arkansas, they would have to follow the HIPAA at your laws, because as HIPAA was constituted, if the state law is more specific and stricter than the federal law, state laws applies. Next, and the other thing I'll talk about here is, you can leave that slide up, that's fine. The next thing I'll talk about here is, so everyone says, oh my goodness, how am I going to secure the data, and how am I going to keep this confidential, and who has access to my records? Well, think about the face-to-face office. Start there. Clearly, in your office, your records are going to be in a locked filing cabinet in a locked office. And if someone were to break into your office and steal your records, you have an affirmative defense that you did everything reasonable to protect the confidentiality and the privacy of those records. You could not prohibit someone from not breaking into your office. But if you left your records out on the waiting room desk for patients to read as they're waiting to see you, then you're not using reasonable care or expertise to protect those services. And if something were to happen, then you probably could be held liable for not using reasonable care. Now expand that to telepsychological services. If you're in an encrypted platform, if you're in a secure network, and the patient is, if someone were to hack you, you can use reasonable expectation that you did everything possible to maintain the security of those records, and you talk to patients about the differences. However, if you're at Starbucks on their internet access, which is open and it's not closed, or at a hotel in a hotel room providing electronic services to a patient in another state, you're not in a secure network. People can hack, people can overhear. And so it's kind of like leaving the records outside in the waiting room versus having it under lock and key. Telepsychological, if you're in an encrypted network and secure with limited access and not in a place where people can overhear or easily hack or listen into your conversations like at a Starbucks, Wi-Fi, that's all you need to kind of do. And you also need to know what to do. As long as you're doing those things, and things unfortunately do happen, you're probably going to survive an ethical challenge or a legal challenge. Next slide. You need to kind of dispose your data. So if laptop and you're getting a new one, or a computer that you're getting a new one, you just don't want to throw it away in the trash. There are programs out there that will destroy and erase all of the information from your hard drive so that it's not there. The same thing with faxes. Believe it or not, faxes have a hard drive, and if you're faxing PHI or other information to someone else, that's still there, so you don't want to throw your fax away. You need to wipe that out. Next slide. This is testing. This is an interesting thing here. Prior to COVID, not many people were doing psychological testing over the internet or electronically because of the reliability and validity issues, and the tests weren't normed over that. Testing companies over the last several years are beginning to validate the tests for over the internet use, and given with COVID, more people are starting to do some types of an assessment. It's always good if you can have a proctor with the patient in the distant thing. If you're doing an IQ test, for example, and may want to need a proctor there to do whatever performance things you need to do. There's some things that you may not be able to do if you use the Rorschach cards, the doctor. Neurological back, more difficult things that may be an easier assessment that you may be able to do over the internet that is now developing standards. I'm doing okay here? Yeah. Okay, and so you also need just to kind of make sure you're following and adhering to the standards of education and psychological testing. Next slide, please. This is the interjurisdictional practice. As you can see here in APA, this is all you need to know. Psychologists are encouraged to be familiar and comply with all relevant laws and regulations when providing telepsychological services to patients across jurisdictional and international borders. So we can stop here because I know all of you are familiar and all you comply with all the nuances. But we spent in the task force, and I was staff to the APA ASPPB Trust Task Force. We spent months, it seemed like, just talking about this and the language here, and this was a compromise language. And then from this, next slide, ASPPB put together the standards task force, and I was staff to this. And you can see the language here is different. It's not strive to, attempt to, or ensure that you. This is more regulatory, held to the same standard of care, competency, conduct when providing more traditionally face-to-face services. You shall be licensed or registered in Canada in good standings where you are. You shall be, shall equals is a legal term, which basically is must. So you must be aware of the location of the patient. So if you have a permission or you're licensed, let's say in Arkansas and Texas, and prior to COVID, you could see that person based on the fact that you're licensed in both places and the patient's in Texas. Now, let's say that patient goes on holiday skiing in Colorado. You may not be able to provide services there because you're not licensed in Colorado. So you need to be aware of where that patient is, because that will determine if you have the authority and the ability to provide services to someone in that jurisdiction. Standard 4 just talks about, we'll talk more about this in the second half when we get to PsyPACT. Next slide, please. And the same thing, you need, when there's a conflict between jurisdictions of laws, regulations, and standards, you hear the laws, and PsyPACT addresses this. So we'll talk about this as we go further. And so here, 6, 7, and 8 deal with competency and technology. You need to be competent to provide the services, ensure the electronic security and the integrity of the records. Number 8, be competent in the maintenance of privacy, confidentiality as it relates to. So rather than aspire to or aspirational, the standards are the floor of what is mandated that psychologists do. And some jurisdictions have begun to adopt these standards, and these standards are a part of PsyPACT. As people begin to use that, they'll have to attest to following the APA guidelines as well as the ASP2B standards. Next slide. Let me just, a couple things on this to highlight. You need to talk about the onset of each contact, identify the patient, make sure that you in fact are seeing the same person who you think you are. You kind of, we talked a little bit about that. You also need, under number 9, to let the patient know, particularly if you're in Arkansas and you're seeing someone in Montana, let's say, that in your informed consent or your website, that if something were to happen bad in that relationship, you need to give information to all of the folks that if they wanted to file an ethical charge against you, here's the process for them to do so. And that way it kind of ensures that people who aren't in your state, but you're providing services to in other states, have that ability in the unlikely event that something happens. But we wanted to make sure that people have the ability to understand how to prosecute, or not prosecute, but to file a complaint with the licensing board or college. Next slide. So what laws do you apply? Where you are, where the patient is, how do you deal with conflicting laws? We talked about duty to warn a little bit. Let's talk about duty to report child abuse. Different states have different levels of care, of reporting liability, reasonable belief, reasonable knowledge, reasonable suspicion. And each of those legal terms mean different things in different states. Some states you only report if the patient comes before you and tells you that they're being abused. Other states, if your next door neighbor who's not a psychologist, who's not a patient of yours, is just your neighbor, if over cocktails one day they said, you know, I'm abusing my child, in some states, you're a mandated reporter to report that child abuse, even though there's no fiduciary relationship or therapeutic relationship between you and your next door neighbor. So you need to understand the nuances. In Pennsylvania, for example, if I'm reviewing a chart for Social Security disability, for example, and in one of the reports, it says that there's suspicion of child abuse, I'm a mandated reporter, even though I have nothing to do with the patient or the claimant for disability. Under Pennsylvania law, I have to file a complaint with children and youth. So the other difficulty about reporting is if you file a report in your jurisdiction, there's immunity. So that as long as it's a good faith report, and it's not grossly negligent, and we won't get into that, but a good faith report, it's unfounded, you can't be sued or brought before an ethical licensing board for a complaint because you're following what you're mandated to do. The problem is with the immunity, it stops at your border. So if you're seeing someone in Texas and they're telling you about child abuse, and you, again, who do you report it to? Arkansas, and then they talk to Texas, or do you report it to Texas Children and Youth? Assuming you report it to Texas Children and Youth and there's a hearing and it's unfounded, the person that you just reported to Children and Youth or whomever, whatever agency in Texas is, they could sue you for breach of contract, defamation of character, slander, libel, because it's unfounded. PsyPACT resolves these things. Record keeping is kind of an easier one, but different states have different record requirements. Some states require 5 years to keep it. Some states require 7. The APA records looked at 7. Medicare talks about 10 years. If you're in a forensic situation, like a horrible divorce situation, and both parties are very contentious and they sue each other every 6 months or so, you may want to keep those records forever. Because those records may be subpoenaed in the 40th or 50th iteration of some type of lawsuit from one party to the other. And you work in different jurisdictions, so if in Pennsylvania it's 5 years and I'm seeing someone in Jersey and it's 7 years, the easy thing for me to do is just keep records for 7 years because that satisfies both. The other new thing that's popping up is the red flag laws. And what red flag laws are, let me take a drink of water first. About 16 or 17 jurisdictions. If you're seeing a patient and they are mentally ill and dangerous and they own guns, you have an affirmative action to call law enforcement and or the courts. And the courts and or the police will take away the guns and they'll have a hearing to determine whether that person is competent to own those guns and to have those guns in their possession because of their mental illness. What do you do if you're in one state that has a red flag law going into another state which does not, and the person you're seeing in the other state is mentally unstable and they hold a lot of guns? Do you report that? And to whom do you report that, or do you not report that because they don't have a red flags laws? And the interesting thing here for me, just to show you how things are changing, and psychology and healthcare needs to kind of keep up with things. Prior to the mass shootings in Florida 4 or 5 years ago, Florida had a law that said it is illegal and unethical for a physician or a psychologist to inquire as to whether an individual owns a gun. You couldn't ask that question in an interview. It couldn't be part of your records because it violated the Florida Constitution and by access the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Since the mass shootings in Florida, Florida has dropped that law and they now are a red flag state. So if someone is mentally unstable and you believe a threat to themselves or someone else, you have an affirmative obligation to notify the police so they can take away the weapons, to have a hearing for the court to make the determination as to whether those guns should be removed. Also, on the other end of it, it's not your responsibility to say, okay, this person is stable, bring back the guns. They have to go back before the court, and the court then will make that determination as to their stability and whether the guns can be returned. So these are the differences of the laws, and these are the 4 or 5 areas that make interjurisdictional practice difficult. Next slide. So let's talk about how things were pre-COVID, and I got 3 or 4 more slides, and we'll take a break. So generally speaking, prior to January 1, 2020, you need to be licensed where you were and the patient is. Different states have some temporary practice, like for example, if you're a psychologist in Arkansas and your patient is going to University of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania will allow you to see that person up to 14 days without notifying the board, without getting a license and so forth. Delaware, it's 6 days. Other states, you can't even go in for 1 second without being fully licensed. Some states you need to have temporary practice, which is but you still have to notify the board. You still have to apply for licensure. It's not a full license, it's temporary just for those 1 or 2 patients that you're seeing. And unfortunately, each state is different. And so the general rule that I always told everyone is you need to know where the patient is and what those laws are. And if you're not sure, you can go to the ASPPB website, and we have links to all the jurisdictions, what those laws are, requirements for licensure or waivers or temporary privileges and so forth. Before you could see a person electronically into another state. Next slide. So with COVID, things changed, particularly and primarily because of governor's orders in some states. The devil in the detail here is you need to be specific, you need to be aware of what executive order is for which state. Here are two sites, APA on their site, they have resources that you can Google and it'll pull up all the states and what the executive orders are. Some states there are no executive orders. Some states there are executive orders that don't apply to psychology. Example, there are a couple of executive orders that apply to physicians and nurses, but not psychologists. In Kansas, there's an executive order allowing for interjurisdictional practice to see people into Kansas without being licensed, provided that you're part of the healing arts professions. Unfortunately, in Kansas, psychologist is not part of the healing arts profession, and therefore psychologists could not come in under a governor's order to see someone in Kansas. Chiropractors could not, chiropractors primarily couldn't see patients telepsychologically or telehealth-wise because they typically were not included. Dentists, for example, typically weren't included. The other thing is you can see the ASPPP, that's our website. We have all the jurisdictions with all the executive orders. And in the beginning, we were updating. So your, if memory serves me correct, and well, I won't talk about you because you don't care, but from outside, initially, Arkansas allowed people to see anybody telepsychologically, and then the executive order was changed and only existing patients. So you need to be aware of what's going on, and some states increase the number of days, some waive, next slide, waive whether you apply in person to that board or whether you can just do it. Deal with parity. Most have relaxed locations. Telepsych prior to COVID had to be from an office to an office, not from your house to the patient's house. You couldn't use phone in terms of Medicaid or Medicare. Those things have been relaxed to allow that to happen. Some states expedite license. Next slide. But some states don't have executive orders. So while you think you can practice, you may not be able. It's not the executive order that Arkansas does. It's the executive order where your patient may be and what that order will allow you to do. So for example, in Illinois, there was an executive order to allow people to come in to see people in Illinois without being licensed. And it ended May 30th. On June 1st, it was extended to June 27th to allow that to happen. On June 27th, it again was extended to July 26th. So as of now, you can see people into Illinois, if your patient's there, without being licensed there. Come July 26th, if that order is not renewed, then you have to stop seeing that patient because you're only authorized to provide services. So you need to understand these aren't stagnant, and they evolve and they change to meet the circumstances. For example, in North Carolina, their executive order ended June 30th, and there hasn't been an order, so you can't provide services into North Carolina unless you're licensed there. New Hampshire just passed a law yesterday saying that the executive order will now be permanent and will allow for certain things to provide telepsychology within New Hampshire, not the interjurisdictional piece, but they've kind of permanentized it. Today, Secretary Azar, next slide, we'll go to the next slide and talk about that. So the federal laws, oh goodness, I'll speed up. only apply to federal programs like Medicare CHIPS. Some states have relaxed it, and you can do that. Pence called for interstate license of all to allow psychologists to provide through telepsych. It's wonderful that Pence did that. It has no meaning because those are state issues. And if states want to adopt that through an executive order or legislative, then that would, just like Azar said that he's going to continue the national emergency, which is set to expire July 25th for another 90 days. That's all well and good with Medicaid and Medicare and CHIPS and so forth, but it really doesn't have a meaning in terms of state action because states need to kind of do that from you seeing a patient from state to state. Next slide. Ted Cruz introduced a bill to say that let's continue telehealth to treat patients up to 180 days at the end of the national emergency. So that if this were passed, which it's unlikely to be passed, come October 25th, I guess is 3 months from now, if that national executive order, emergency order expires, then this would kick in for 180 days after that to kind of allow telepsych process to go forward. Next slide. So post-COVID, what we're desperately trying to do in psychology and other healthcare professions are doing is to have a soft landing so that we can kind of ease in rather than a hard turnoff of the spigot. But there are some states that are just turning it off as they're trying to go back and opening up their states. And so a lot of the executive orders don't exist anymore. And now you have to deal with things pre-COVID. ASPPB is working with all of organized psychology to kind of deal with the unintended consequences that students, licensees, applicants for licensure are dealing with due to the virus. Hopefully we'll have a white paper or guidance sometime, I'm hoping in September, that we can send out to our member jurisdictions. APA is involved in the process, the Canadian Psych Association is involved, as people from education and training, people from the profession, and so forth. Next slide. So let's stop here and take a break. I'm sorry, I'm 4 minutes over. We can start at 5 after, if that works. And I'll talk about PsyPACT and compacts and kind of tie up loose ends.
Great.
And you're foolish enough to tell your patient, hey, I'm in Washington too, let's have a session. And think about it, it's an Arkansas psychologist talking to an Arkansas patient. What does Washington State care? Unfortunately, Washington State does care because you're in Washington and you're not licensed to practice in Washington State. So you could not see that person. Under the compact, if your patient went to Washington and both Arkansas and Washington were part of the compact, you could see that electronically. And if you were stupid enough, again, to tell the patient you're on vacation, let's have a session, you could have a session with that person in Washington, provided that it's ethical. You don't want to have it in your hotel room. You can't have an office there. You could call a colleague to rent space for an hour or to make sure that it's ethical to provide that services. Once you're in Washington, however, you cannot use Washington as your hub because you're not licensed there. And you could not use Washington then to see people into Colorado or New Hampshire. That only emanates from Washington. Excuse me, that only emanates from Arkansas where you're licensed and where you're physically located. Next slide. It works the states to work together. The commission develops its own body. And this is what I said at the beginning. The commission is made up of one representative from each compact state, and they get together and they develop the bylaws and the rules for the implementation of the commission. Each state has a vote as to what those laws will be and majority rules. So the commission has already developed 7 or 8 definitions already and rules so that any other state coming into the compact would automatically be held to those rules. One of the rules, for example, in the 4 corners of the document, PsyPACT, it says you must have a graduate degree. We did that purposely and if someone wants to ask that question, I'll answer it, but I don't want to kind of go down that road yet. But the commission, in one of their rules, they define what a graduate degree is, and they said you need to have a doctorate in psychology. So PsyPACT only applies for someone that has a PsyD, a PhD, an EDD, and is licensed in that jurisdiction. It's not for masters, independent practice people or masters under supervision. And it's just for doctorate at this point. And so it has nothing to do with ASPPB. The commission is its own entity. They've hired ASPPB to provide staff services to the commission. Next slide. This is what we've kind of taught. You would apply for the commission for authorization to provide interjurisdictional practice. Next slide. You need to have an e-passport, which is the mechanism to allow that to happen. This is a relationship between the psychologist, licensing boards, and the receiving state. Next slide. Here are the requirements. You have to have a license. It has to be unencumbered. You can't have no disciplinary history, no criminal history, no child abuse. You have to have, you will make certain attestations for intended practice and work experience and what state you're planning to see people into. You must abide by the guidelines and the standards and any other criteria that the rules that the commission develops. And so since you're practicing from one state into another state without being licensed, those states want to ensure that people coming in are qualified, meet the requisite education, training, experience, and have no disciplinary or criminal history to provide services. Now, someone doesn't have to use PsyPACT. They can get licensed in that other jurisdiction the old-fashioned way. They can go to Arkansas. Suppose you want to get licensed in Texas. You can send an application to the Texas Licensing Board, and they can review it and decide whether they give you a license in Texas or not. And you're then obligated to pay fees and continue education. And but PsyPACT just bypasses that process. Next slide. Next slide. This is the IPC. We talked a little bit about this. Will allow you to go temporarily into another state. Next slide. Here are the requirements for the IPC. They're very similar to the e-passport criteria. No criminal history and so forth. Next slide. The benefits we talked about earlier, it increases access to care, continuity of care. It certifies that psychologists meet standards of practice. It promotes cooperation between and among states so that they can share disciplinary data. Unfortunately, in our profession, when I was on the Pennsylvania Licensing Board, we had several complaints against people that were licensed in multiple states, and they had multiple complaints filed against them. And we used to refer to them as high flyers because they had complaints filed against their practice in several jurisdictions. This forces states to work together so that someone doesn't slip through the cracks and provide services into another state. And once you are sanctioned by the board, the e-passport is removed, or if you violate the standards or the attestations by the compact, your e-passport can be removed, and therefore you cannot provide services into any other jurisdiction. And it increases consumer protection, as we're kind of talking about, across state lines. So states are working together and ensuring what laws apply and how you do it. Next slide. The benefits, so this is just another slide hammering home this point. The challenge is that you need to figure out how you do this. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You don't want to make it so strict that only, for example, if you were to say only ABEPs can apply for PsyPACT, you're only talking about 3 or 4% of psychologists who have ABEPs. If you say anybody and everyone, then you're dealing with people that have been sanctioned or who might have been licensed prior. And so you really need to find the sweet spot where you're allowing for the greater number of people who want to provide interjurisdictional telepsychological practice to continue that. Next slide. We've been endorsed, PsyPACT's been endorsed by all of Organized Psychology, APA, the practice organization. I think they've changed their name now to the APA practice, the students, independent practice, the state and provincial association, the military, the trust, advocacy groups like Citizen Advocacy Group, APEC, American Telemedicine, the American Board of Professional Psychology. So all of the major stakeholders in all of organized psychology believes this is important. Jared Skilling, who's the chair of the practice, looks to this as one of the priorities that they want APA to get involved in. And they have set aside funding for those states that might need assistance in lobbying legislators about adopting PsyPACT in their jurisdiction. When I see Jared at any PLC or any other meeting, part of all his presentations is talking about PsyPACT, because he believes this is something that's unique to psychology, because social work isn't doing this, counselors aren't doing it, so they look at it as an enhanced service and something that psychologists can benefit and distinguish themselves from other mental health providers. The regulatory world looks at it differently and saying we want to provide a legal and ethical means to provide interjurisdictional practice by resolving those issues. So to go back to the duty to warn standard I'm sorry? We're good? Okay, to go back to the duty to warn through the informed consent process, you'd have a discussion with your patient saying that I'm in Arkansas, there's a duty to warn standard, and you're in Texas where there's not. We're going to follow Arkansas law here, and if you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, I have to stop you from doing that, or warning another person, or getting law enforcement involved. And therefore, because it's a compact and it's agreement among states, that then has the teeth of the law. If you are just seeing someone not through the compact, and you're licensed in Arkansas and Texas, and a complaint's filed against you in Texas, Texas may say, we don't have jurisdiction in the matter because Sigel's not a licensee of Texas, it's a licensee of Arkansas, we don't have any authority. And if a complaint was filed against you in Arkansas, Arkansas would say, we don't have jurisdiction because it's not a resident of Arkansas, it's a Texas citizen, and so nothing would happen. PsyPACT resolves that by forcing the states to work together and honoring each other's subpoenas and dealing with discipline, so that in the unlikely event that something were to happen, the states would work together to prosecute that case to ensure that the public was protected. As you know from your psych association, you're more forward to what the guild wants to do, what's the interest of psychology. The licensing board is focused on the protection of the public, the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of your jurisdiction. While there's great overlap, there are some differences between that. Next slide. Here is the map of the United States. The dark blue states are the ones that are PsyPACT states. I have another slide that for those of you who are like me are challenged geographically, will articulate that. The light blue states are the ones that have passed PsyPACT, but their dates haven't been enacted. The black states are where there's active legislation. So if you look around Arkansas, you have Missouri to your north, Oklahoma and Texas to the west. Tennessee has legislation that we're optimistic that will pass in the fall. To your east, Alabama, when their legislature gets up and running, are going to do that. I've not heard anything from Louisiana in terms of what they may or may not, or Mississippi, or what they may or may not want to do with PsyPACT. Next slide. So here is the list of where we are. Arizona was the first. Virginia, as you can see, becomes effective January 1 of next year. And for some reason, North Carolina lost, they're going to be effective in 2021. Here are the states. So each one of these has a representative and they sit and resolve the issue. The other thing that we talked about earlier in terms of child abuse reporting, because it's a compact and because states are working together, the immunity should, cross the border because it's part of the compact. And it's hopeful that the commission will develop rules to that effect as they continue to go forward. Next slide. Here's the states with active PsyPACT legislation. I know last night Rhode Island Senate had hearings, and the governor is proposing that all the major healthcare compacts be adopted in their state. And from what I know from Peter Oppenheim, who was there, or telepsychological, or excuse me, he provided written testimony and observed. He said that the Senate was very predisposed in favor of it. Tennessee, as I said, is going to deal with this in the fall. The District of Columbia, I believe, will deal with this in the fall as things begin to settle down with COVID. So we're very optimistic about that. Ohio, it's already passed out of the Senate and it's moving, it's in the House now, and hopefully in the fall they will consider. So we're thinking potentially over by the end of this year, in addition to the 15 states, we may have another 2 or 3 that have adopted. We know in 2021 that there are 7 to 15 states that are actively considering pursuing PsyPACT legislation in the United States. The other thing I should mention is, as I started with, ASPPB is made up of states and provinces. The compact is just among the states and territories. It's not with the Canadian provinces, because if we were to do something like that officially, it would no longer be a compact, it'd be a treaty, and then you'd have to have advice and consent of the United States Senate and the president to sign it. And they're not going to deal with stuff like this. But our Canadian counterparts in ACPRO, they're working on something very similar across Canada in terms of telepsychological practices between the provinces. And just like our CPQ model, that if you're licensed in Arkansas and have a CPQ and wanted to get licensed in Ontario, Ontario would recognize the CPQ and facilitate licensure in Ontario. We're optimistic that there'll be a mechanism, not formally, but informally, that will allow people to provide services from certain compact states into the Canadian provinces. I know there's a compact with the maritime states, and I know ACPRO is working on spreading that across the jurisdictions. So we're optimistic about that. Next slide. We talked about this. The commission comes up when there's 7 states. We have 15. It's been formed. They have 1 representative. Most of the representatives mostly are from licensing board members or executive directors of the licensing board, or state can appoint an attorney who works for the licensing board, or in some states, the commissioner for occupation and professions, they're part of the commission. But by and large, most of the commissioners are psychologists, which is what we wanted, who have some experience with regulations to kind of help deal with those disciplinary and regulatory issues, as well as understand how to provide psychological services. Next slide. The first meeting took place last year. This is an old slide that I did not update. We have 15 states. Or the first meeting, I'm sorry, there were 12 at the first meeting. 11 commissioners were there, and Illinois did not provide someone at that time. When there are states, the next meeting is in November for the commission, and even though Virginia and North Carolina won't be officially part of that, they'll be invited to the commission meeting. They'll be allowed to participate in the deliberations and discussions, but they would not be allowed to vote on anything until they're actively, till their effective date and they're an official member. Next slide. This is just what happened in the first meeting. Next slide. These are some of the rules that were adopted in the February meeting. One had to talk about the definition of doctoral degree. Another had to do with subpoenas. That right now, if you're in Arkansas and your patient is in Texas and you issue a subpoena in Texas, Texas doesn't have to honor the Arkansas subpoena because they don't have any authority to prosecute that in Texas. Under the compact, states have to work together, and Texas would have to honor Arkansas's subpoena. And if the courts in Arkansas did not honor Arkansas subpoenas, what the commission did was then that the licensing board in Texas would then have to file the subpoena on behalf of Arkansas and Texas, which then would make it legal, and the Texas would have to honor that subpoena. So it allows for states to work together. Next slide. Right now, we're accepting applications as of July 1. We've had about close to 400 people that are applied. PsyPACT should become operational in several days, maybe more or less. Next slide. So we just kind of talked about it. The state enacts it, the commission's established. You would apply for either the authority to practice interjurisdictionally and get an e-passport, and or the IPC to temporarily go into. You can do one or both. Next slide. Here are the fees associated. There's a $40 fee to the commission because ASPPB is not authorizing this. The commission is authorizing you. The e-passport will cost $400. However, there is a grant that HRSA gave to the commission that will waive the $400 fee till the end of the year, and there's talk about the possibility that may be renewed. So people who are applying aren't paying the $400 fee, but there is a renewal fee. And some people say, well, geez, that's a lot of money. Yeah, it is on some level, but if you have the opportunity to apply services now into 15 jurisdictions, if you wanted to do that now, it would cost you a hell of a lot more. There's one psychologist who's widely well known, who's a forensic psychologist, is probably the leading expert in death penalty cases and intellectual disability. He's licensed in 26 jurisdictions. He has a full-time person just to manage his licensing and CE requirements. He believes every time he testifies in a jurisdiction, he needs to be licensed there. It's untenable to require psychologists to be licensed everywhere that one patient may be and pay those fees. But licensing boards, on the other hand, want to ensure that people coming in are competent based on their education, training, and experience, and no disciplinary actions to provide those services. And so part of that is ASPPB is vetting the education, training, and experience and the disciplinary history to ensure that those folks that are using the passport under the commission aren't blemished in terms of their professional criteria or they had the requisite education. Next slide. We just, for those of you, unfortunately in Arkansas, since you're not from a PsyPACT state, you can't apply for PsyPACT yet. But if you wanted to start in anticipation that this is something that your psych association and your legislators want to do, it would make sense for you to, okay, 2 more minutes, to start with a credentials bank by putting the information that you'll need to apply for the e-passport. You can do that now, it's free. And so when Arkansas becomes hopefully a member of PsyPACT, you can start the process right now through the credentials bank. Next slide. I think there are 2 or 3 more left. And this is what I just talked about. And what I talked about in the beginning with early career folks. Next slide. Here's a website if you're interested, PsyPACT.org. And those are the commissioners at the first meeting. Next slide. I'll entertain questions. You can go to the next slide. You can follow us on Twitter or email. It's PsyPACT.org. And go to the next slide, which is the last, we did this. We're on Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. If you're interested, ASPPB will be more than happy to assist the association in advocating on your behalf if that's what you want us to do. We're not going to come in without the Arkansas Psych Association invitation. And like APA, we have some funding. We can't lobby legislators, but we can educate legislators on your behalf. And the other thing that I didn't talk about, next slide, the Department of Defense, this is one of their high priorities because they see this as a way to provide services to military spouse and military children. If I'm, and the VA, I'm having a meeting with them to deal with similar issues. If I'm seeing someone in the military in Arkansas and they're relocated to Georgia, I can continue seeing that serviceman into Georgia because of the supremacy clause. But if I was seeing the kid in Arkansas and the family's now in Georgia, I cannot see that military child because they're not in the military, and I would have to be licensed in Georgia, which is why the Department of Defense is very high on this, and some of the governors are in favor of this, as well as the Council on State Government. So I'll stop and entertain questions here.
All right, thank you, Alex, so much for that information that you provided us. I know everyone has appreciated all of the information that you've given. So what I want to do, we have a few questions in the chat box, and so everyone, all the attendees, I'm keeping my eye on the chat box. If you have any questions that you want to go ahead and include, and I'll read those off to Dr. Sigel here. And then if there are other questions that need to be answered more specifically for people here in Arkansas, Cammie and Tisha and Glenn are still available to answer those if needed. So Dr. Sigel, one of the first questions that we have, I think you may have already addressed it, but I want to just go ahead and ask it to see if you have any more additional information you want to provide. So someone says, I understand that this is currently for doctoral level psychologists. Will there be work to include LPEI, so it's master's level psychology professionals?
So the document was written specifically for that. We used a graduate degree in psychology for that possibility. We know that to get this through the majority of states, you need to have a doctoral degree. They're not going to let someone from Arkansas with a master's or Vermont with a master's who can practice independently come into Pennsylvania because you wouldn't meet the criteria. We're hopeful that as PsyPACT works on the doctoral level, the document was written in such a way that 2 or 3 years from now, we can tweak the document and come up with a separate PsyPACT to deal with master's level folks, to deal with the 15 states that recognize master's level for independent practice or supervision. But right now, because of overwhelming majority of states, you need a doctorate. It wouldn't work to convince them to allow masters to come into a doctoral level state.
Okay, thank you for that. And the person said that's good news. So yeah, thank you for that information. Another person had a question around forensic custody evaluations. So the question is regarding forensic custody evaluations, should people keep records just indefinitely, like forever keep records, or just until minors are legal adults because parents can no longer litigate for custody?
That's more of a risk management question. And if you have the insurance trust, I would call them and they'll answer that question a little differently. But I'll answer it personally for me and not speaking for regulatory bodies, since I do forensic work. If it's an uncontested divorce and there's no problem, you can keep it for whatever your law requires. If it's a contested divorce, if they keep every 3 or 4 years coming back and you may anticipating things are going to happen until the kids reach the age of majority, I would hold on to those records based on that. And I would do that with some of the criminal cases that I've been involved with that are open and shut. The person pled guilty, I'm doing a downward departure, I keep it for the 5 years. But in some of the cases that I've testified where there are appeals and there may be significant appeals going forward, I keep those records for a lot longer.
Okay, thank you for that. Another attendee had a question when you were, I think when you were referencing like the 30-day time period that somebody, oh, so you know what I'm referring to. So this person asked, is it 30 days per patient or is it 30 days total no matter how many people you have in the state? For example, our office is close to Missouri, so I could possibly do 2 or 3 visits in a week with separate people. So
let me answer that. The answer is the latter, that it's 30 days into that jurisdiction. It's not consecutive. It could be over the course of the calendar year. 1 minute is 1 day. So if you saw 1 patient, that would count as 1 day. If you happen to see 2 people on that same day, that would still be 1 day. The other thing is, this is not an end around of having you on the border saying, oh, good, what I can do is I'll set up a temporary office. I'll start seeing people on Mondays. I'll take the Monday holidays off. I'll take the summer off, and that'll leave me 23 days that I can set up a temporary practice. It's not intended for that. You can't have a brick and mortar office. You can't have landlines. You can't have business cards made up. It's purely for the temporary practice to do that.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, at this point, I'm not seeing, those were the questions that I've seen so far throughout the presentation. If people have any additional questions, I think, Dr. Sigel, we have about 5 more minutes. And let me see, another question has just come through. Some psychologists might worry that PsyPACT may allow large corporations to come in Arkansas and swamp the state with cheap psychological services, thus crowding out Arkansas psychologists. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm asked that everywhere I go. I'll answer it 2 different ways. The first way is it's kind of zero-sum game isn't working. It's not the right word. But as people come into Arkansas, it also means that Arkansas psychologists can go into other states to see, so that may be a wash that way. PsyPACT was written, and the commission is very much aware of these large groups coming in, and the groups per se would not be eligible to join PsyPACT. This is for the individual psychologist. It could be for a sole practitioner who's incorporated. For example, I'm a sole practitioner, I'm incorporated, I'm not part of a large group. I could apply for psychology as an individual, but a large entity could not come in and saying, hey, we're going to bring our 60 psychologists to come in and provide services. It was written in such a way that, for example, in some of those large platforms, you have no idea who or where the patient is. You may just have a texting relationship. You don't know who the name of the person is. You just have what their sign-in is and so forth. Those people, those platforms would not be eligible to come in under PsyPACT. We're very cognizant of the fact that we don't want those entities to be involved, to come in and to take over Arkansas psychologists and compete with them. In every other state where this issue has been raised, and Virginia was the last one that I was at, they had some concern. And all of those states, as they kind of worked through the process, they realized that it still made sense for them to be part of the compact. And so all of those states raised that issue, but they still have joined the compact.
Okay, thank you for addressing that. And it kind of related to that, Dr. Sigel, when you have presented and talked with other states, have there been any other concerns that people have had that you want us to think about as a state?
Had you asked me that in November,
Okay.
I'd have a different answer. Because it was an uphill battle for me from 2008 and particularly the last 3 or 4 years talking about telepsych, because most people were saying, why do we need to do that? I'm never going to do telepsych. I like seeing people in my office. It doesn't make sense for me to see someone 3 or 4 states over. Since COVID, all of a sudden people look at that entirely different and realizing that they're getting more comfortable with telepsych. They're getting more comfortable with the fact that their patient may be relocated and they're seeing it under executive orders. So some states are now seeing compacts as part of the COVID response, even though it wasn't intended to do that. But some jurisdictions, Tennessee's one, are looking at it and saying, hey, we need to do something. This will deal with the interjurisdictional problem post-COVID. Prior to November, I think the concerns I heard was the one about big corporations coming in and stealing patients was the issue. The other issue had to do with differences in laws. Our laws are better than your laws, and you need to follow our laws as opposed to where the patient is. But as you kind of work through the process, the states that raise those issues either have introduced legislation or have passed the legislation.
Okay. Thank you. And you guys, I think we have, for those who are attending, we have maybe about 3 or 4 more minutes just for questions. So we may just leave it open for questions. So feel free to put that in the chat box. Attendees or even people who are panelists, feel free to add some questions.
And if people have questions that they think of in the next day or so or whatever, or want to text me or email me, please. My email is asiegel@asppp.org. It was on the last slide. Please feel free to reach out and email me.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Sigel. As we're waiting for other questions, if people have them, do you mind? You said that some of the states who were concerned about large corporations coming in, that they considered that, talked through it, but still found that they wanted to go ahead and move forward with PsyPACT. Was that because they just saw the potential benefits and they felt like the benefits outweighed any of those concerns, or were there other things that they considered?
I think as they worked through the process, they realized that it probably was not going to happen like they think they did, that there may be sufficient safeguards to stop that from happening. They look at the benefit of being part of the compact outweighing the negative aspects of it. For example, Florida has a law that if you're a licensed professional, you can use telehealth to see people into Florida, physicians, architects, engineers, whatever, and you can telepsych or telehealth into Florida. You need to notify the board, you need to have a registered agent, which is a technical term, you need to attest to certain things, but you can do that. But it doesn't help Florida psychologists or Florida other professions, because that law doesn't allow Florida professionals to see people in other jurisdictions. It's only a one-way road. And so Florida thinks that's great. The professions in Florida think the law sucks because it doesn't help them.
Okay, I see. And people are noticing these benefits and noticing that this could address that. Yeah, okay.
Because it primarily deals with continuity of care and access to care. For a psychologist, if your patient, that you're seeing an adolescent, and in Arkansas, and they come to Pennsylvania to go to school, you got to stop seeing the person unless you're licensed here. And so does that patient need to find a Philadelphia psychologist? I think so. And what happens when the person comes back from Arkansas and goes back to Little Rock over Christmas? Do I, as a therapist who saw him for 2 or 3 years, see that person again now? Or would that be interfering with what's going on with the current therapist who's been seeing them for 3 or 4 months? And then that raises ethical issues potentially as to there are too many cooks in the oven with this patient. PsyPACT resolves all those issues and allows you to continue with the continuity of care.
Right. And I'm pretty sure those issues of continuity of care and access to care have certainly come up enough for a psychologist that we really want to kind of seriously consider this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to let folks know that I typed into the chat the email for Dr. Sigel.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Glenn. Okay, yeah, and people will see it there in the chat box. That's right, Dr. Siegel's email address.
Right.
Thank you. Well, is any other thoughts you kind of want to leave us with, Dr. Sigel, as we continue to kind of think over all of the great information you provided today?
However, I or ASPPB can be of your assistance as you kind of go through this process. We'll be more than happy to kind of work with you. What we decided, as I mentioned, since your licensing board is neutral or positive, we can work. Had your licensing board said we don't want to have anything to do with this, we would not take an active role coming in. We were surprised in Alabama that it was introduced by a legislator who had contacts with the Department of Defense, and I got a nasty call from the licensing board in Alabama saying, "How are you introducing this without consulting us?" And I said, I didn't know. And the Psych Association called me up and said, "Why are you doing this without talking to us?" And I said, I'm just hearing about this first. We had no idea that someone was thinking about introducing it. And we will not be involved with that process unless and until you want us to be involved in the process. Alabama, incidentally, has adopted all the healthcare compact. So I think this legislator who introduced the other bills was introducing another healthcare bill, and he will advocate to kind of get Alabama on board with this compact.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. All right. Well, what I'm going to do is turn it back over to Dr. Mays and Dr. Dean to wrap us up and close us out. Thank you again, Dr. Sigel, for
My
your
pleasure,
time.
and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about telehealth and PsyPACT.
Absolutely.
Great. Kami, are you going last or am I going last?
You're fine. If you go on and go with the call to action and try to get some interest from those surveys, I appreciate that. That's what I with. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. I believe this is the third or fourth time I've gotten to hear you talk about PsyPACT, and every time I learn something new, and it's always evolving, so I really appreciate it. For most people on the call, I believe, know who I am, but I am Tisha Dean. I am a past president, past treasurer, and current government relations committee chair, with Dr. White working very, very closely with us. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Patty Waltz, who has also been really instrumental in bringing Alex on and really helping to push this this idea further. And was on the call. I think she's still here. So thank you, Patty, so much. This is definitely a team effort, and I do not take credit for it. A years-long team effort. So as the government relations chair, we have kind of worked and, as Alex alluded to, talked to the psychology board. They are not going to actively oppose if ARPA decides that they want to and to work to enact this legislation. And we are actively gathering information and trying to know what the interest is from our membership and from just psychologists in the state. And you likely have seen in your email and on the listserv that we have a lot of information that you can read that Dr. Sigel talked a lot about today. And we also have a survey, and we would love for you to fill that out because we are really gathering information. We want to know the important things that are going on, and we want to be able to make sure that we have the support that we need, because if we plan to and we really go forth with this initiative, it's going to take a lot of work from our entire community, and we want to have we want to make sure we have the support, and we also want to make sure that those of you who are interested can get on board and help us out with identifying legislatures, making sure that we have information to the legislators and that we are able to be successful. And so I'll put my email in the chat box. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. Reach out to Cami or reach out to Glenn, and because we want to get your help on board. Thank you. So I'll let you wrap it up, Cami.
Again, please look for the URL to be posted again soon. I'm hoping that someone is able to go through their email for that survey, if possible. And again, we'd like you all's help, if possible, at least giving us feedback in terms of what your feelings are. We really want to do what's best for all licensed psychologists of Arkansas. If there aren't any questions, Glenn, do you have anything else you'd like to add in terms of what we'd like? Okay, Dr. Glenn. Okay.
Kyla.
Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to unmute for some reason. At any rate, no, I have nothing else other than if we do proceed, you will hear the alert for the call for volunteers, and that can take lots of different forms up to and including personal appearances in the legislature and the Capitol, or emails, phone calls, talking to your personal representative, that sort of thing. Just, you know, maybe even editing, writing letters, anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Kyla, I think I had seen a question about the CEs. I didn't know if you wanted to just briefly give that info.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly give that information as we wrap up. So after we conclude today, an email will be sent to you with a PowerPoint slide. So Dr. Sigel has graciously agreed to provide his slides from today and an evaluation of the webinar. So that will be emailed to you. And after you complete the evaluation, then the certificate for the CEs today will be emailed to you after the evaluation is complete. And we have recorded today's webinar. And within a week or so, it will be uploaded to the ARPA YouTube channel. So you can review it there afterwards, and then maybe let other colleagues know who would like to review it as well. Thank you all for your time and attention today. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day and weekend.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
All
you.
right, bye, Dr. Sigel.
Thank you, Dr. Sigel.
Thank you very much.